8. The genetic bottleneck theory. Modern human genetic diversity is lower than you'd expect for a species our size and age, and geneticists have long read that as the signature of a population bottleneck sometime between roughly 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, when the number of breeding humans may have dropped into the low thousands. For years, the leading suspect was the Toba supervolcano eruption in Sumatra roughly 74,000 years ago, an eruption large enough to plausibly trigger a multi-year volcanic winter. That pairing made intuitive sense and became a staple of popular science writing, but it's worth being clear about where the research actually stands now. Newer climate modeling, ash layer dating, and paleo-environmental data from East Africa have significantly weakened the Toba connection. Several research groups have found no evidence of the severe, years-long vegetation collapse the theory predicts, and some geneticists now argue the population decline started earlier than the eruption and continued well after it, meaning Toba likely wasn't the cause, and the sudden catastrophe version of the bottleneck story may not be accurate at all. What this means is that one of the more dramatic claims in this genre, that a single global disaster nearly erased humanity around 74,000 years ago, is currently on shakier scientific ground than it was 10 years ago, not stronger. The archaeological record before roughly 70,000 to 100,000 years ago is genuinely sparse compared to what comes after, and that's a real pattern worth explaining. But sparse evidence of complex culture is not the same as evidence that complex culture existed and was destroyed. The far simpler explanation, that dense, symbolic, technologically layered culture took time to develop and leaves more traces once it does, currently fits the data better than any lost civilization alternative. I want to flag that distinction clearly, because it's the difference between an open scientific question and a story built on top of one. 7. The out-of-place artifacts problem. Archaeology has a rough sequence: stone tools, then bronze, then iron, then writing, then complex civilization. Scattered through the record are objects that seem to break that sequence, so-called out-of-place artifacts, or OOP arts. Most of these resolve quickly once examined properly. A few genuinely don't, and those are worth taking seriously. But it matters enormously which category a given object falls into, so let's sort them. The real one, the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a shipwreck off a Greek island that sank around 60 BCE, the device itself, a bronze mechanism with at least 30 interlocking gears capable of modeling the sun, moon, and planetary positions and predicting eclipses, is now dated by historians of science to roughly 150 to 100 BCE, built somewhere in the Hellenistic world, possibly Rhodes. Nothing of comparable mechanical sophistication survives from the next 1,400 years. That gap is real, and still not fully explained. The mainstream explanation isn't a lost civilization, though. It's that this kind of precision engineering existed in a craft tradition passed hand to hand in workshops, rather than written down in the texts that happened to survive, and that most other examples were melted down, lost at sea, or simply never preserved. The Antikythera mechanism isn't a signal from someone else's civilization. It's most likely the one surviving fragment of a fairly narrow slice of our own. The ones that don't hold up. The so-called Baghdad battery. Clay jars from the Parthian or Sassanid period containing a copper cylinder and iron rod can produce a weak electric current when filled with an acidic liquid, and that's been demonstrated. But archaeologists broadly reject the idea that they were built or used as batteries. There's no evidence of wiring, electroplated artifacts, or any device they could plausibly have powered, and more mundane explanations, like scroll storage, are considered more likely. The Dendera light bulb, carvings in the Temple of Hathor showing an oval shape with a snake inside, is not ambiguous to Egyptologists. It's a well-documented mythological image, a lotus flower giving rise to a serpent resting on a jed pillar, tied to Egyptian creation symbolism. It has no wiring, no filament, and no supporting archaeological context suggesting electrical technology, which otherwise leaves zero trace anywhere else in Egypt. And the pre-Columbian gold aircraft figurines from Colombia and Costa Rica are, according to the archaeologists and zoologists who've studied them, most consistent with stylized depictions of local fish, insects, and birds rendered in a regional artistic style, not scale models of airplanes. The lesson from all of it isn't nothing strange exists. It's that a handful of genuinely puzzling objects get diluted by a much larger pile of claims that were investigated decades ago and didn't survive the investigation. 6. The Göbekli Tepe problem. Discovered in southeastern Turkey and excavated seriously starting in 1994, Göbekli Tepe is a complex of massive carved limestone pillars built starting around 9600 BCE, roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge. The people who built it had no pottery, no metal tools, and, as far as the evidence shows, no established agriculture. That's what makes it genuinely destabilizing to the old textbook sequence. The T-shaped pillars, some standing 5 to 6 meters tall and weighing up to several tons, are carved with detailed reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. Moving and carving stone at that scale, without metal tools or draft animals, implies a level of organized labor, quarrying, transport, coordination, that the old model said hunter-gatherer societies simply shouldn't have been capable of. The previously accepted story was agriculture first, surplus food second, then the free time and social hierarchy needed to build monuments. Göbekli Tepe reverses that order, or at least complicates it badly, and it's forced a real rethink in the field about how far organized human cooperation predates farming. What happened afterward adds another layer. Around 8000 BCE, sections of the complex were deliberately buried under thousands of tons of packed earth and rubble, not destroyed by war, not simply abandoned, but intentionally covered by the people who used it. The leading interpretation is that this was a form of ritual closure. With only a small fraction of the site excavated and related structures now identified elsewhere in the region, most archaeologists studying it expect Göbekli Tepe is one node in a wider pre-agricultural network we're still mapping. None of this requires an unknown prior civilization. It requires giving pre-agricultural humans considerably more organizational credit than they used to get, which is itself a significant shift. 5. The sunken coastlines hypothesis. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were about 120 meters lower than today. Huge areas now underwater were dry, habitable land, much of the Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf connecting present-day Indonesia and mainland Southeast Asia, the Bering Land Bridge. As the ice sheets melted, especially through a series of rapid pulses at the end of the last glacial period, that land flooded. The geology here is solid and uncontroversial. What's much less solid is the specific claim, popularized mainly by the writer Graham Hancock, that these drowned coastlines hid a technologically advanced global civilization that seeded later cultures. It's worth being direct about this. Hancock is not an archaeologist, and his central claims have been examined and rejected by the professional archaeological community. Not ignored, examined. The core objection isn't dismissiveness. It's that a civilization capable of what Hancock describes should have left tools, settlements, burials, and cultural transmission that we'd expect to find inland as well as offshore, and we don't. The genuine open question underneath the popular version is narrower and more interesting. Because humans preferentially settle near coasts, and because those specific coastal zones are now the hardest and most expensive parts of the planet to excavate, we probably do have an incomplete picture of pre-agricultural coastal habitation. Underwater sites off Japan and elsewhere have produced real archaeological debate about which formations are human-made versus natural. The submerged structures near Dwarka, India are a good example of that ambiguity. Some researchers have proposed they're man-made, but a substantial number of geologists consider them natural rock formations, and the dating evidence isn't settled. The honest state of the field is underexplored and genuinely uncertain, not confirmed lost civilization. 4. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate flipped abruptly from post-Ice Age warming into a sharp, roughly 1,200-year cold snap called the Younger Dryas. Ice sheets re-advanced, megafauna populations crashed, and human groups across North America and the Fertile Crescent faced serious environmental disruption. In 2007, a group of researchers proposed that this cooling was triggered by a cosmic impact, or airburst, over the North American ice sheet, pointing to nanodiamonds, platinum enrichment, and melted glass-like material found at sites on multiple continents. That's the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and here's where the earlier framing of this topic needs a real correction. This is not a settled, widely accepted finding. It's one of the more actively contested debates in quaternary geology. Proponents have published extensively defending and expanding the evidence base, including recent platinum and shocked quartz findings. Critics, including a large, detailed 2023 review, argue the supporting evidence is methodologically flawed, not reproducible across independent labs, and better explained by ordinary volcanic or terrestrial processes, and that no impact crater of the required size has ever been found. Both sides have published forceful rebuttals of the other since. The fair summary is a genuine, unresolved scientific dispute, with more researchers on the critical side, not a hypothesis that's crossed into consensus. The civilizational question built on top of this hypothesis is speculative regardless of which side turns out to be right. If a Younger Dryas-scale climate shock happened, and something clearly did happen to the climate around that time, whatever caused it, any societies living through it would have faced wildfires, flooding, a hunting resource collapse, and rapid, disorienting environmental change. Flood narratives appear independently across many unrelated mythological traditions, and it's a legitimate open question in comparative mythology whether any of them encode memory of real Pleistocene-era flooding events. That's a real and interesting research thread. It's a separate claim from the Younger Dryas impact is proven, and treating the two as the same thing overstates both. 3. The geological memory theory. This category splits cleanly into evidence and legend, and it's worth keeping them apart. The evidence side is genuinely well supported. Geographer Patrick Nunn and colleagues have documented Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that describe specific coastlines being flooded, with geographic details matching underwater topography that was dry land during the post-Ice Age sea level rise, roughly 7,000 to 18,000 years ago. These stories appear to have been transmitted with enough fidelity to function as rough geological records across many thousands of years, a genuinely remarkable finding about the durability of oral culture, published in serious geographic and anthropological journals. The legend side is Atlantis, and here the popular narrative and the scholarly consensus diverge sharply. Plato described Atlantis in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE, framing it as an account passed down from the Egyptian priesthood through the Athenian statesman Solon. The scholarly consensus among classicists, archaeologists, and historians is that Atlantis was very likely Plato's own invention, a philosophical device used to illustrate ideas about hubris, political virtue, and civilizational decline, not a report of a real place. No source independent of Plato mentions it. No confirmed archaeological site matches his description, which places Atlantis as an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, larger than Libya and Asia combined. A landmass that scale, if real, would be very hard to miss entirely on modern seafloor maps. Some researchers have proposed the story was loosely inspired by the real Bronze Age eruption of Santorini and the fall of Minoan civilization, filtered and reshaped over centuries of retelling. That's a defensible hypothesis about inspiration. Atlantis was a real advanced civilization, is not currently a position most classicists or archaeologists hold. The Maya long count calendar is real, and does begin at a date corresponding to August 3114 BCE in Mesoamerican cosmology, and Mesoamerican tradition does describe prior world ages that ended in destruction before the current one. Structurally similar previous ages myths do appear across Hindu, Norse, Greek, and other traditions. Comparative mythologists debate how much of that similarity reflects genuinely shared deep history versus how much simply reflects that flood and cyclical collapse stories are a natural response to living on a planet with floods, volcanoes, and generational memory of hard times. Both are live positions in serious scholarship. Neither one requires a lost global civilization to explain it. 2. The Permian-Triassic extinction. This is the entry that needs the most careful separation between hard fact and speculation stacked on top of it. The Permian-Triassic extinction, roughly 252 million years ago, killed an estimated 96% of marine species and around 70% of land vertebrate species, the most severe mass extinction in Earth's history, well beyond the later Cretaceous extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. The cause is attributed to the Siberian Traps, a period of enormous volcanic activity that released massive volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide over tens of thousands of years, triggering runaway warming and ocean acidification.